Sauce. Impulso. Jam, jam. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming on. We'll give it a few more minutes and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, we'll get started now. I hope everybody can hear me well. John, can you hear me? Excellent. Good morning here in North America, and good evening, good afternoon. Thank you to all who are joining us today. My name is Moses Hisa, with my distinguished and esteemed colleague, Professor Jonathan R. We co-chair the Uganda Studies Group, an affiliate of the African Studies Association. This group seeks to create and strengthen international networks between writers, activists, scholars, journalists, artists, and public thinkers of and in Uganda. You can follow us on Facebook on Twitter, and on our website, www.ugandastudiesgroup.org. Today's engagement is part of a speaker series with leading scholars, activists, civic leaders, and journalists of Ugandan politics and society about their scholarship, their public service, and civic works. If you'd like to present a paper, launch a book, speak about an intellectual project, or provide some insights on issues about Uganda, please get in touch with Dr. John All or with me. It's our distinct privilege and honor to welcome Dr. Yahya Sseremba, research fellow at the Makerere Institute for Research, on the occasion of his soon-to-be released book, America and the Production of Islamic Truth in Uganda, which is coming out with Routledge. Dr. Sseremba's book investigates the ways in which the war on terror has transformed the post-colonial state in Africa. Taking American intervention in Islamic education in Uganda as the entry point, the book demonstrates how state control over Islamic truth production and everyday Muslim life has increased. A thorough exploration of US foreign policy and Islamic education, this book will be of interest to students and scholars in the fields of political studies, African studies, and indeed religious studies. Dr. Sseremba will speak for about 30 minutes, after which we will open the floor for discussion, question, and answer. My brother, Dr. Sseremba, you're very welcome, and it's great to have you. Thank you for coming. We'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Moses, for that kind introduction. I thank the leaders of the Uganda Studies Group, especially Professor Moses Kisa and Professor Jonathan Eyal, for giving me the opportunity to talk about my new book, which will be released next week, inshallah. The book contributes to the literature on the nature of the modern state in general, and specifically on the nature of the post-colonial state. How does the state govern society? Specifically, how does the Ugandan state govern the Muslim? And more specifically, how is the pervasive American global interest in Islam shaping the ways in which the Ugandan state governs the Muslim? The book begins with a brief history of political power before and after the formation of the Ugandan state. Particular attention is paid to three historical moments. First, the mid-19th century, when the Kingdom of Buganda witnessed the spread of Islam under Kabaka Mutesa I. Outwardly, Islam appeared to strengthen the power of the king over society. Unlike in the past, when spirit mediumship and other avenues constituted important forms of power alongside royal power, Mutesa emerged as the Imam of Buganda on top of being King of Buganda. He was Imam not simply in the sense of leading the prayers in the mosque, but in the more important sense of being the leader of the Muslim political community that the Buganda Kingdom was increasingly becoming. Through Islam, Mutesa outwardly appeared to have achieved the unification of royal authority and spiritual authority that his predecessors had pursued in vain. But a closer examination of the situation reveals that Mutesa barely succeeded in concentrating power in his hands and in maximizing state power over society. This became clear when his authority as the Imam became questioned, when the Muslims refused to pray behind him because of his unsatisfactory Islamic credentials. In chapter 2, I argue that Mutesa's attempt to use Islam to centralize the power achieved little because of the private character of religious authority in Islam. The authority to interpret Islam has traditionally belonged to those who have the knowledge to interpret Islam. This authority is not political, not social, not even religious. I examine the relationship between Mutesa and his Muslim followers to argue that 19th century Buganda largely belongs to the pre-modern era when society governed itself through society-based mechanisms like custom and religion instead of fully submitting to the state. The second moment I examine in the history of political power is the colonial era, especially the beginning of the colonial era, when what I call the Muslim domain was created by Frederick Lugard. As we all know, Lugard conquered Uganda in 1892 following years of conflict between the Protestants and Catholics and between the Muslims and Christians. He needed stability if he was to govern the colony. He initiated a settlement to address the conflicts between these factions. Part of the settlement was to distribute the provinces of Buganda to the three warring religious factions. The Muslims at the time were in exile in Bunyoro following their previous military loss to the Christians. Whereas the Christians preferred to exclude the Muslims completely, Lugard insisted that the Muslims must return and be part of the political community that he was forging in Uganda. Of course, the Protestants took most of the provinces, followed by the Catholics, and lastly, the Muslims. Usually, scholars focus on these and subsequent forms of discrimination to castigate colonial rule. Whereas Lugard clearly discriminated against the Muslims, he also single-handedly insisted that the Muslims must be included in the allocation of Uganda provinces. Yet, whereas he included the Muslims in the Uganda political community, he excluded them from the mainstream of the political community by forming a distinct domain for them. This domain, the Muslim domain, had three main features, namely the Muslim homeland, that is Butambala, Mohammedan chief, and Mohammedan law. What does this arrangement tell us about the ways in which the colonial state governed the Muslim? The Muslim was governed in two ways, partly as a peripheral member of the Protestant-dominated civil society, and partly as a member of a distinct Muslim domain. Whereas Lugard allocated most of the provinces of Uganda to the Protestants, he insisted that these provinces would never constitute a Protestant land.
Hello.
Should I continue?
Yahya Sseremba.
Why are you so nigger?
Yes, I'm saying that whereas Lugard allocated most of the provinces to the Protestants, he insisted.
Yes, Yahya, very good.
Yes. This is so cool, bro.
Whereas Lugard allocated most of the provinces to the Protestants, he insisted that these provinces would never constitute a Protestant homeland. The Protestant was a citizen of Uganda, not a member of the Protestant homeland,
Uganda forever. Uganda.
Which never existed.
John Early, don't look at me. I will kill your mother.
So
I wonder whether
I'm
this
sorry,
person can be muted.
I like my brother,
Yes.
Yahya Sseremba, my brother.
sorry,
I like
Sseremba,
to-
we're trying to find the person to remove.
Yeah, I found him and removed him, John. Yahya, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much.
Apologies, Sseremba.
I was saying that whereas Lugard allocated most of the Uganda provinces to the Protestants, he insisted that these provinces would never constitute a Protestant homeland. It was the Catholics and Muslims who were members of their respective homelands, namely Butambala and Buddu respectively. I'm not simply interested in stating that the Protestants were privileged at the expense of the Muslims and Catholics, which is common knowledge. Rather, I'm locating the discrimination of the Catholics and especially the Muslims in the universalization of Protestantism as a national citizenship identity on the one hand, and the provincialization of Islam as a local and territorial identity associated with a specific place and domain to which it was confined. What then does this arrangement tell us about the nature of the state that the colonialists constructed in Uganda? It was a state that was founded on the distinction between the citizen and the subject, to use Mahmoud Mamdani's theorization of colonial power. In Mamdani's theory of the state, as we all know, the difference between the citizen and the subject involves two major aspects. First, the citizen is governed directly by the central state, while the subject by the native authority. Second, all the citizens are governed under one European law, while the subjects are organized around the tribe, and each tribe is governed by its own customary law. Rights apply to citizens, while custom to subjects. But unlike in Mamdani's theory, in which the urban-based settler represents the citizen,
oh, my retarded niggers,
and the
make sure
rural-based
to join
native represents the subject, here we
for
see
clothing
that the
before I rape you.
Protestant
I
was
also
the
want
citizen, while the Muslim was the subject, and the Catholic was somewhere in between. Yet, the distinction between the citizen and the subject should not be understood in rigid terms. In this case, the Muslim was governed in three ways, or would move across three spaces. First, as a citizen, though a lesser citizen, governed directly by the central state and by European law in certain aspects. Second, as a tribesperson, subject to the tribal native authority, the Buganda Kingdom in the case of Buganda. Third, and most importantly, as a Muslim subject to Mohammedan law in a Muslim homeland presided over by the Mohammedan chief. Like the tribal customary domain, the Muslim domain was subject to much colonial state interference. However, there is an important aspect of the Muslim domain that largely escaped the attention of the colonial state, and that is Kabalaza education. Kabalaza literally means veranda in Uganda. In this case, it refers to the colonial era Islamic schools in quotes, which operated on the veranda of the Muwalimu. Muwalimu is the localized version of the Arabic word muallim, which means teacher. Specifically in Uganda, it means Islamic religious teacher. Excluded from secular education that was controlled by the church, Muslim families turned to the Muwalimu and his Kabalaza school to educate their children. This made the Muwalimu an important player in shaping the Muslim subject. There was no curriculum. Every Muwalimu taught his pupils basing on his own knowledge and judgment. The modern madrasa evolves from the Kabalaza school. Like the individual Muwalimu in the colonial era, who was free to determine what he teaches, the modern madrasa also remains free to determine its own curriculum, either as an individual madrasa or as a group of madrasas under a certain umbrella. The Kabalaza education represented the limits of the colonial state in shaping the Muslim population. The colonial state focused on shaping the education of future Muslim leaders. Far from shaping the general Muslim population, the colonial and post-colonial state hoped to rely on the leaders of different Muslim factions to control the general Muslim population. post-colonial politicians would invest heavily in co-opting Muslim leaders to deliver the Muslim population. President Amin, however, went beyond the politics of co-opting Muslim leaders and created a central Muslim authority through which the state could govern the Muslim population. This authority was known as the Uganda Muslim Supreme Council. The Supreme Council centralized and monopolized all Islamic religious authority in theory and to a great extent in practice. The state banned all competing Muslim authorities except the Supreme Council. The state also banned all the interpretations of Islam that were not sanctioned by the Supreme Council, including Salafism that was beginning to emerge. The monopoly of the Supreme Council in the production of Islamic school was spelled down clearly in its constitution. The constitution put the authority to interpret Islam in the hands of a small group of individuals known as the Majlis al-Ulama, or Assembly of Religious Islamic Scholars. The same assembly assumed the authority to produce, confirm, and discipline the teachers and preachers of Islam known in Uganda and elsewhere as sheikhs. The constitution says, and I quote, "The Majlis al-Ulama shall address itself to and make final decisions on all matters relating to the interpretation of the Quran and Hadith, the pronouncement of fatwa, the training, education, confirmation, and disciplining of sheikhs, the promotion of da'wah, and such other matters as are incidental to the foregoing." End of the quote. By creating the Supreme Council, President Amin sought to eliminate the private character of religious authority in Islam and replace it with a national Muslim authority that the state could easily hold accountable. The literature on Amin has focused on Amin the brutal dictator, but there is also Amin the thinker and reformer. The creation of the Uganda Muslim Supreme Council exemplifies Amin's attempt to turn Uganda into a truly modern state that dominates society through institutions. The modern state, including Muslim states, whether democratic or otherwise, have found it useful to eliminate the private character of religious authority in Islam and create a central religious authority in order to bring Islam and Muslims under total state domination. Whereas Amin the reformer can be called a Ugandan indigenous thinker, his thinking makes sense in the context of colonial modernity in general and in the context of the modern state in particular. The modern state, as we all know, by virtue of being a modern state, necessarily eliminates or at least regulates and subordinates all society-based authorities in order to bring society under complete state domination. In this case, Amin the thinker is not an original and creative thinker, considering that his ideas operated within the framework of colonial modernity and especially the framework of the modern state and post-colonial state. After all, the Uganda Muslim Supreme Council was only a sophisticated version of the Mohammedan chief that the colonial state invented. By monopolizing the authority to produce Islamic truth, the Uganda Muslim Supreme Council was an attempt to introduce some sort of church in Islam. This is the corrupting and colonizing influence of the modern state. The point I should stress here is that President Amin went beyond the politics of co-opting and relying on Muslim leaders and attempted to bring the Muslim population under institutional state domination through the Uganda Muslim Supreme Council. Another point to note here is that President Amin did not seek to dismantle the Muslim domain inherited from the colonialists. Rather, he only sought to reinforce it in unprecedented ways. This means that the bifurcated character of the post-colonial state was reproduced through the formation of this Supreme Council. With the end of Amin's government in 1979, the regimes that followed had no clue on why Amin created the Uganda Muslim Supreme Council. They allowed the council to continue its disintegration, and the private character of religious authority in Islam was fully restored. The Muslim individual sheikh as an interpreter of Islam resurfaced. All the competing Muslim authorities that Amin had eliminated resurrected. Today, the Supreme Council is only supreme only in name. It is just one among many different Muslim authorities in Uganda. Now, the American government has mounted another attempt to eliminate the private character of religious authority in Islam in order to bring Islamic truth production and the Muslim population under state domination. In the name of fighting terrorism and combating violent extremism, the US Department of State seeks to bring the mechanisms of Islamic truth production, especially the madrasa, under direct state control and general scrutiny by any citizen. The US seeks to dismantle, or at least to downsize significantly, the Muslim domain as a distinct entity. To make this point, I begin by examining the ways in which the American government and its agents have formulated the relationship between the madrasa and political violence. I look at the research and body of knowledge that the American government or its consultants and other players in the war on terror have produced on Islamic schools in Uganda and elsewhere. In brief, the American government thinks or purports to think that the content of madrasa education is problematic because it contains extremist ideas and produces violent or potentially violent graduates. Second, these alleged extremist ideas come from foreign sources, especially Saudi Arabia, in the form of Salafi literature. Salafism is seen in these discourses as a particularly violent interpretation of Islam. The alleged extremist ideas are said to easily find their way into the madrasa because of the poor organization of Islamic schools. This alleged poor organization is symptomized in the absence of a homogeneous standard education curriculum, meaning that each school authors its own curriculum, and there is no central authority to scrutinize and approve these different curricula. Finally, the students of madrasas are said to be vulnerable to this extremist education content because they lack critical thinking abilities necessary to interrogate such ideas. So, these narratives recycle the most contemptible assumptions of colonial anthropology to claim that the violence of Muslim actors is caused by Islam or a certain interpretation of Islam or Islamic education. In other words, if you want to understand the politics of primitive peoples like the Muslims, simply look at their culture or religion. According to these discourses, the Muslims don't think, they don't act, they are simply driven by religion. Religion in these discourses is understood as a fixed body of orthodoxy that makes the believers, but the believers do not make it. The believers do not have power over religion. The Ugandan Muslim is assumed to have no role in the making of Salafism. Rather, it is Salafism, which is presumably imported, that makes the Ugandan Muslims and it drives them to engage in violence. These are the kinds of stupid assumptions informing the research that American agents have conducted on Islamic schools in Uganda and elsewhere. I have a chapter in the book focusing on how this so-called research is produced. I show that whereas the local Muslims have participated in this American research, their participation has been reduced to that of data collectors and native informants. The local Muslims have no meaningful role in formulating the research question. As all scholars know, the researcher is the one who formulates the research question, not the one who simply collects data. And as all scholars know, the research question is never an innocent question. It is embedded with the assumptions and conceptual framework and biases of its formulator. Unfortunately, poverty has reduced many talented Ugandan scholars, including Muslim scholars participating in this so-called research, to mere data collectors and native informants in search for survival. Yet, the culturalist assumptions of the Americans are shared by the Ugandan government, which explains why the regime in Kampala is very receptive to America's prescriptions for Islamic education reform. The relationship between the state and the Muslims has been complicated since the colonial era. Under the current regime of Museveni, a section of Muslims mounted a rebellion to seize state power. A number of terrorist incidents in Uganda have been blamed on the ADF, which official and popular narratives present as an exclusively Muslim and especially Salafi rebel group. The state has closed down many madrasas in the name of combating terrorism. The Ugandan state has all along been using repressive measures like raiding Islamic schools, arresting teachers, etc., to deal with what it considers to be the security threat of the madrasa. Now, what the Americans want is to take the Ugandan state beyond these coercive measures and focus on shaping the production of Islamic truth. When the Americans came with their prescriptions, the state was more than receptive because it considered Islam, especially Salafism, to be the cause of the violence of Muslim actors. Yet the manner in which the Ugandan government and the popular narratives associate Salafism with violence is misleading in a number of ways. First, it exceptionalizes the violence of the Salafis and Muslims in a country whose entire history is punctuated by rebellions of all ethnic and religious tribes. Reports indicate that Museveni's government alone has fought about 24 rebel groups since it came to power 3 decades ago, almost 4 decades ago. Instead of contextualizing the violence of the Muslim in the historical and political atmosphere that keeps on producing rebellions and political violence in Uganda, the war on terror narratives blindly blindly blame Islam, Salafism, and the madrasa. Second, the war on terror narratives fail to locate the violence of the Muslims in the broader minority question at the heart of the foundation of the Ugandan state. And finally, the narratives selectively privilege certain incidents in the history of Salafism and produces a vulgarized and completely misleading picture of Salafism. Yet, the point of the book is not to refute these culturalist explanations of violence which dominate the war on terror narratives. Rather, the book is interested in what these narratives allow the American and Ugandan governments to do. In my eyes, it doesn't matter whether these claims are true or false. What matters is the purpose they serve. And here I ask 2 questions. What kind of knowledge does the counter-terrorism project produce about the madrasa? Put differently, how is the madrasa understood and portrayed in counter-terrorism discourses? Second, why is the madrasa understood and portrayed the way it is understood and portrayed in counter-terrorism discourses? To examine the agenda of the knowledge that is produced about the madrasa, I look at America's prescriptions for madrasa education reform. At the time of writing this book, some of these prescriptions were at preliminary stages of implementation by two consultants hired by the US Department of State, including the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy and the United Religions Initiative, Great Lakes. The International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, or ICRD, understands the relationship between Islam and political violence in such a simplistic, Islamophobic, and racist manner that it has compiled a list of Quran verses that purportedly drive Muslims to kill Americans and non-believers. There is completely no historical context, no political context whatsoever in its narratives, just empty culture talk. The ICRD has one universal template for Islamic education reform that it peddles from one country to another with minor modification. Key in the reform prescriptions is the homogenization of the different madrasa curricula into one homogeneous curriculum. Second, the creation of a central madrasa regulating authority that would preside over all Islamic schools. This authority would purportedly identify and weed out extremist material from the Islamic school curriculum. The authority in question is not the Uganda Muslim Supreme Council. Rather, it would include what the ICRD calls stakeholders within the Ugandan government and civil society. At best, the Muslim authority would send a representative to this council. Also part of the reform is the introduction of education content that purportedly builds the resilience of the students against extremist influences, purportedly rife in the madrasa. And also checking the inflow of foreign education material, training and introducing minimum qualifications for teachers, homogenization and standardization of the curriculum, etc. These prescriptions indicate that the American government is determined to dismantle or at least downsize the Muslim domain as a distinct entity, as Muslim affairs, especially the madrasa, come under direct state control through this council and the scrutiny of any interested party in society. But the reforms have met stiff opposition from the Muslim community, and it's not clear how the Americans will be able to achieve their objectives, their reforms without using violence or without using force. So let me conclude with one point. So almost all the Muslims have always had a critique of the madrasa. Most of the Muslims will tell you clearly that there is a problem, there is something that needs to be done about the madrasa. And for that matter, the madrasa has constantly been transforming. It has undergone significant transformation since the colonial era. It is not static. It is not static, neither is it homogeneous. Not only are the Muslims critical of the madrasa, but they are also critical of Islamic knowledge generally and the ways in which Islam is understood in Uganda. So, if the Muslims themselves are critical of the madrasa and of Islamic knowledge, why do many of them oppose America's prescriptions? The problem is that the Americans are not interested in joining the conversation on the madrasa in Uganda, which is taking place within the Muslim community. Far from joining the conversation, the Americans think that they can bring their prescriptions and impose them on the Muslims. They have formulated the problem unilaterally, and they have devised the solution unilaterally. What they mean when they talk about the participation of the local Muslims is participation in data collection and in the implementation of solutions manufactured in Washington. There is something to note about the opposition that the Muslims have mounted against America's prescriptions. Whereas the Muslims have a critique of America's prescriptions, they have no critique of the modern state. Their own initiatives operate within the framework of the modern state. Yet the problem of America's prescriptions is only a manifestation of the problem of the modern state, whose determination to be the only authority prompts it to find ways of subduing society completely by eliminating or at least subordinating society-based authority. With or without America, Islam, like any other aspect of society, will come under state domination. It does not matter whether the state is secular or Islamic, liberal or non-liberal, capitalist or socialist. Scholars interested in decolonization still have a very long way to go to explore possibilities of a life beyond the captivity of colonial modernity, of which the modern state is only one aspect. This does not mean that the local Muslims, this does not mean that the opposition that the local Muslims have mounted against America's prescriptions is pointless. The Muslims are not rejecting state power. They are rejecting the demonization of Islam that is behind America's Islamophobic and racist madrasa reform project. The role of the state in America's reform project is to protect society from the threat of Islam. This Islamophobic and racist agenda must be rejected by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sseremba. So in listening to your presentation, I have many questions and many things that I would want to talk about. And I know we're soon going to open the floor for questions and comments, but maybe I could take the liberty to share 3 opening questions. If you would like to take any one of them. The first is, what surprises did you discover during the course of your research? Were there particular research conclusions that you unearthed that you didn't imagine yourself discovering along the way? The second question is, I've long felt that Yusuf Lule's political biography is one of the most understudied in post-colonial Uganda. And I'm wondering if during the course of your research, you found yourself in large amounts of conversations about President Lule and about his own relationship with own relationship with Islam and the larger Protestant establishment in Uganda. And then a final question is, thinking about madrasa reform. So since the Bush administration, there have been very different administrations in power. We've had President Obama, President Trump, and now President Biden. And when we think about the long history of madrasa reform in US foreign policy, do you feel that there has been general continuity across each of those 4 administrations? Or do you feel that there have been noticeable changes across those 4 administrations, Bush, Obama to Trump to Biden? And if so, what have those changes looked like? And so I'll stop there because I also see there are other questions coming in. So if you would like to take any of those, and then we can turn to open the floor.
Thank you, Jonathan, for those questions. I will request you to repeat some of them as I was attending to my kids here who were interrupting my my presentation, my attention.
Of course. So maybe,
please do repeat the questions, and I will take notes. I've gotten rid of the kids.
So that's okay. So in brief, the first question was surprises along the way. Were there discoveries that you ascertained during your research that you did not expect? The second question is about how can we think about President Lule and his own attempt to navigate Islam in the Protestant establishment in Uganda? And the third question was about American foreign policy across Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden. And if you've noticed any significant changes in those four administrations in terms of madrasa reform, or do you feel that actually it's been a large amount of continuity across each of those four administrations? Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So I'm not entirely sure whether I came across surprises, but certainly I found things that I never expected to find that I found interesting. And one of them relates to the ways in which the Muslims think about reform, think about Islamic reform. The internal Muslim critique of Islamic knowledge. So so I set out to find out how the Muslims are responding to America's project of reforming Islam. But I realized that there is another debate that is entirely unrelated to America's prescriptions. A debate that has been going on for quite some time, and that relates to the question of what does it mean to be a Muslim in a predominantly Christian, in a predominantly non-Muslim nation like Uganda. A question related to the relationship between the universal and the particular in Uganda. How much of Islam, of Islamic teachings should change in light of the local circumstances in Uganda? The notion of bid'ah, the notion of innovation in Islam, is bid'ah entirely prohibited, or there is some good bid'ah, some good innovations, some good religious innovations that can be adapted in light of the challenging condition of being a minority, a Muslim minority in a non-Muslim society. The question of marriage between Muslims and non-Muslims, for example. So it is strictly prohibited in Muslim societies for a Muslim woman to be married to a non-Muslim man, and also even for a Muslim man to marry a non-Muslim woman is discouraged in Uganda, tradition discouraged in Uganda. But it seems this debate is coming up again. So we live in a reality. We live in a completely different reality in which these things are happening. So what do we do with them? So I found that contrary to the assumptions of the Ontera, which the kind of narratives which has also informed the ways in which I approach this research, that there is an entire extensive debate that is going on within Islam. So reform is not something that the Americans think that they can introduce in Islam, because they think that reform must come from outside. There must be a civilizer, an American civilizer, who comes and teach Muslims how to move forward. Islam is static, how it can move forward, how it can adapt to modernity. So I was prompted to add an entirely new chapter, and that is chapter 8. Chapter 8 relating on the ways, on the contribution of Muslims, the contribution of Ugandan Muslims to the global debate on contemporary Islamic reform. I found that quite interesting, something that I never set out to investigate in the first place. So that's just one of them. Second, so I noted that the Americans say that they are actually not simply interested in Islamic education, but they are interested in education as a whole. In secular education, Christian education, Islamic education. So Islamic education is just one of them. So I learned that in the course of my research. It's not that I believe it. It's not that I consider it to be very significant. Of course, they're interested in all sorts of education, but they have particular interest in Islamic education, especially if you consider the body of knowledge that has been produced around the madrasa. There is a huge body of knowledge that has been produced about Islamic education, in which the madrasa is presented as a threat to American interests, not just a threat to American interests, but a threat to society anywhere in the world, and that Islam must be contained. So whereas I noted that the Americans are interested in other forms of education, but they are particularly interested in Islam. So you asked a question about President Lule. So President Lule is significant in the history of Islam, in the sense that when Lule went to a Christian school and converted to Christianity, the Muslims withdrew their children completely from school, from secular schools. During those times, the schools were controlled by the church. So conversion was an important part of acquiring secular education. So Lule represents, to the Muslims, Lule represents the danger of secular education. He represents the corrupting influence of secular education. And it would take a lot of time, a lot of convincing for the Muslims to take their children back to secular schools, even after the government had taken over secular education. Still, many Muslims were reluctant, to enroll in secular schools. So beyond that historical situation, I'm not sure whether President Lule is of any other significance in the history of Islam. I'm not sure. Then number 3. So American foreign policy. So has American foreign policy remained constant, or it has been changing? America's foreign policy. So I think the American establishment is not a homogeneous group, and we cannot say that it has a single mind. There are debates, there are internal contestations, etc. The regime of Bush cannot be compared to the regime of Barack Obama. The aggressiveness of Bush, the aggressiveness of Trump, especially Trump, his controversial and refined and crude narratives about Islam. So Trump cannot be compared to Biden, who is much more refined, or to Barack Obama. And I want to believe that they also do not agree on how to deal or on how to advance the interests of the United States, how to relate to the Muslims. But I want to believe that the idea that certain interpretations of Islam are hostile to American interests, I want to believe that that is a constant. That is one area in which they all agree. The assumption that, because these reforms did not start under Biden. These reforms have been, the Americans have been engaging the madrasa in this manner for a long time in different parts of the world, including Muslim countries, including Saudi Arabia. So that has been continuous. The idea that certain education material, certain verses should be eliminated, or certain Islamic literature should be banned, should be eliminated from the madrasa, that has defined America's engagement with Islamic education for a long time. There's nothing new about. In fact, much of the opposition of Ugandan Muslims to America's reform is based on what the Americans have previously done in other countries. It's not based on what the Americans have done in Uganda, because the Americans are still trying to do what they want to do. But the local opposition is based on what the Americans have done in other countries elsewhere. So I want to believe that the idea that Islam, or a certain interpretation of Islam, poses a threat to America's interests or to American security, that is shared across the different US administrations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sseremba, for these important clarifications. We've had a number of comments come in, including praiseworthy comments. Everest Nangibirano writes, thank you, Dr. Sseremba, for the wonderful presentation about your book on the history and politics of Islamic truth. The debates you explore are worth engaging. Owechitibwa Isaac Mpanga writes, discrimination against Islam was well entrenched in the colonial life of the natives. Not only were they denied formal education, but were also excluded in matters of public administration. Joining a religion became a matter of scheme to become a chief or a notable. And then we have a question from Mr. Patrick Kayongo. And Patrick asks, you said that you are not against state power. What role do you think the state should play in the regulation of religious activity for the benefit of its citizens?
Thank you very much. Of course, I cannot make a policy recommendation on how the state should continue to dominate society. If anything, I have a critique of the state. And my critique of the modern state is that, and this is obvious, if everyone who's studied the state is aware of this. So the state seeks to eliminate all society-based authority, or at least to subordinate that authority under its own authority. In fact, my own critique of the Muslims, of the Muslim thinkers, both in Uganda and elsewhere, including the Islamists who want to Islamize the modern state. My critique of them is that they have no critique of the state. They have no critique of the modern state. And as a consequence, they have sought to strip Islam of all its diversity and contradictions in order to fit it in the homogenizing structure of the modern state. So I talk about the Islamic law, which has traditionally been interpreted by society members, and which as a consequence leads to multiple different and even contradictory interpretations of Islamic law. Now, when the Islamists wanted to Islamize the state, which monopolizes the authority to make, interpret, and enforce the law, they were confronted with a problem that the modern state can only accept one interpretation of the law, but Islamic law has so many interpretations of the same issue. So what they did was to withdraw the authority to interpret Islam from the individual members of society and give that authority to the state, an assembly of the state, so that there can only be one interpretation of Islamic law. So really, the modern state represents a corrupting influence on Islam. I cannot make a policy recommendation that advances the domination of the state of society, of a society. I cannot make such that what should the state do in order to regulate religion. I'm critical in the first place of the state's role in the regulation of religion, in the domination of society. What I would do instead is to explore possibilities of an alternative way of living beyond the total domination, beyond the colonization, beyond the captivity of the modern state. That would be my interest in decolonization. That's what I understand as decolonization. For me, decolonization is not simply finding more creative ways in which the state can dominate society, can regulate the religion. My vision is to think beyond the dictatorship of the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sseremba. We have more questions coming in. Our next comes from Adventino Banjua, who thanks you, Dr. Sseremba, for your excellent presentation on your important new book. He writes that we can't wait to read the new book, and that there's one question regarding your critique of the Muslim critique of American reform and interventions. And here is the question. Is it to suggest that there is a general blindness to the question of the modern state, or were you able to encounter some exceptions, Muslim voices that couple a critique of the American reform interventions with an identification of the modern state as a problem in itself? So it seems to be, and Adventino, please feel free to correct me if I'm misrepresenting your question, but the question seems to be, were your interlocutors coupling their critique of the modern state with the critique of American foreign policy, or were those seen as two separate things?
Thank you very much, Adventino, for those questions.
No, I was saying that is exactly the question. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Of course, besides critiquing America's prescriptions, the Muslims of Uganda also have a critique of the secular state or some of them, have a critique of the secular state, but they have no critique of the state as a state. So they would be more than happy to have an Islamic state, But to the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware that they have formulated a critique of the state as state, the state as a structure of power. They have a critique of certain manifestations of the state, For example, the liberal secular state. But I have not, to the best of my knowledge, come across a critique of state as a state. Perhaps we may need to do more research and explore whether such a critique has formed or is forming in any way.
Thank you, Dr. Sseremba. Our next question comes from David Chimba, who also congratulates you on your excellent corpus of knowledge about Islam and the political modernity state in Eastern Africa and beyond. And then he presents two questions. First, can we really settle for an understanding of the, quote, Muslim domain, in quote, as a monolithic or homogeneous domain, or whether should we be talking about Muslim domains in the plural, varied, different, or even differing domains? And the second question is there anywhere in this new book where you, Dr. Sseremba, take on Joseph Kasule's theses on the Muslim question in Uganda, especially in his discourse on Islamic reform in Uganda?
All right, thank you very much. These are very interesting questions, especially the first question that should we think of the Muslim domain as a monolithic domain, or should we think of different Muslim domains? So, of course, in any phenomenon, there are always internal debates and contestations, no doubt about that. There is no social phenomenon that is homogeneous, that has no internal tensions. It has never existed. I'm using the concept of the Muslim domain in the general sense. In the general sense, to mean a space that the colonial state created for the Muslims, composed of largely three features: the Muslim homeland, the Mohammedan chief, and Mohammedan law. Of course, that Muslim domain did not remain constant throughout the colonial era. No, for example, the Muslim domain largely, so for example, the aspect of the Muslim homeland largely vanished as Islam spread in different parts of, just like Buddha as a Catholic homeland vanished with time. So the Muslim domain also vanished, even if Butambala has remained a predominantly Muslim territory up to today. So the Muslim domain has not been constant throughout time. But there are certain aspects of Muslim life that belong to the Muslim domain. For example, marriage, divorce, inheritance. These are governed under, the Muslim is free to run these aspects of life under Islamic law, as opposed to state law, to civil law, to European law. So that's one important aspect of the Muslim domain that has remained constant up to today. There have been attempts to challenge it. For example, the feminists have attempted to introduce a single family law that would bring the Muslim under Muslim and Christian under one law, but they have barely succeeded. They have barely succeeded, and the Muslim domain has continued. So the Americans have also mounted their own attempt to dismantle the Muslim domain, and we are yet to see how far they will succeed. So I'm using the concept of the Muslim domain in the general sense to mean those aspects of life that are not part of the mainstream civil sphere. But this is not to mean that there are no internal debates and contestations within the Muslim domain. There are many of them, only that they are beyond the scope of this book. Second, you asked me about Joseph Kasule's book. I think that is a very general question. I don't know how you want me, what specific aspects you want me to talk about. So I think...
if I may clarify, Yahya,
yes,
thank you so much. Just to clarify, not to be general, Kasule has a very, what I think, fascinating discussion on the Islamic reform, particularly studying the question of the ADF and its antecedents, Salafi Tabligh movement. And he gives us a reading of how the colonial state in its later attempts is trying to reform the orthodoxy. It fails, and how Obote comes in, and Obote promises to do something about it, and Obote miserably runs out of steam and time. Amin comes and says, I'm going to deal with this before the ink dries, and I'm going to sort it out once and for all. And it goes on, and NRM Museveni's regime comes in and says, finally, we need to nip the enemy from within. But that discussion of Kasule is what I want you to compare with in your discussion. Is there something? Are you giving Kasule a hug? Are you embracing his thesis? Do you part ways somewhere? Do you give him a punch, or do you give him a tender nudge? I'll be really happy to know.
I think Kasule and I are addressing different problems. Kasule is especially interested in political violence. He's interested in the drivers of political violence. How should we understand the rampant assassination of Muslim leaders in Uganda? What is the role of the state in this violence? What is the role of internal Muslim contestations in this violence? What is the relationship between the two? I'm specifically interested in the discourses around the relationship between Islam and political violence. I'm not particularly interested in the drivers of political violence. I'm interested in how political violence, the knowledge that has been produced around political violence, especially regarding the relationship between the madrasa and violence. Yes, I do have that historical chapter. I do have the historical chapter in which I touch on some of the issues that Kasule also addresses. But really the point of that chapter is simply to lay the foundation, not to engage, to engage those issues in detail. Is largely to pave the way, to give the reader some kind of background where Islam is coming from, where the state is coming from. Of course, there are things that we share with Kasule. There are things that we share with Kasule. For example, the ways in which the state co-opts Muslim leaders. This is something that Kasule also discusses quite well in his book. However, I give much emphasis to Idi Amin's regime. Idi Amin's regime attempt to institutionalize and centralize the process of Islamic truth production. So in summary, I will say that Kasule and I are addressing two different problems. We have areas where we diverge, but these are largely minimal. There are areas of convergence and divergence, areas where we meet and where we separate. But the bottom line is that we are addressing different problems.
Great, thank you, Dr. Sseremba. Next, we have Professor Moses Hissa, who has a comment and or question to share.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you, Brother Yahya, for fascinating and deeply penetrating presentation, and congratulations on the book. I wanted to ask you to comment on the internal Muslim critiques of madrasas. What do Muslims internally say is wrong or needs to change about madrasas? And I was interested in that because you did speak to it. You said there is internal critique. There is no unanimity or sweeping endorsement of the madrasa institutions. What do Muslims say? And then second bit that I want you to comment on actually is on David Timber's question earlier. So the historical part of your work is not just mere background, I want to believe. What is it from the past, from the pre-colonial and colonial era? What is it that connects to the present? The war on terror is something that is distinct in your work, but how is that connected to the past discussion and analysis that you do in the book? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Moses, for these questions. So let me begin with the second question. So how does the pre-colonial, the colonial, and the post-colonial connect to the contemporary? That is the main preoccupation of the book. Now, first and foremost, I am interested in the ways in which the Ugandan state governs the Muslim. My discussion of Mutesa, I'm sorry for that. So my discussion of Mutesa is intended to understand that what is the nature of power before the creation of the colonial state. What is the nature of power? Specifically, does Mutesa succeed? To what extent does he succeed in centralizing power, in combining religious authority and political authority and dominating society? I'm interested in that. So in the colonial era, I'm interested in what is new, what changes, what remains constant. If Mutesa does not succeed in subduing society, how does the colonial era proceed to subdue society? And I say it forms the Muslim domain. And it succeeds to some extent. But I identify a gap. I identify some limitation in the colonial state. And I locate those limitations in the Kabbalah's education. Whereas the state is able to dominate the Muslim, creates a domain for them, governs them in that way, But there is something that remains beyond the reach of the colonial state. And I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in the colonial and post-colonial states' preoccupation with Muslim leaders, patronage, co-opting Muslim leaders in order to deliver the Muslim population. So Obote forms an alliance with Sheikh Kamulegea. Kamulegea forms NAM. So Mutesa gets into an alliance with the Kiburi group under Prince Kakungulu. So the post-colonial politicians are using Muslim leaders, in order to reach out to the Muslim population. And I say Amin is an exception because he resurrects the so-called Mohammedan chief of the colonial era, but in a more sophisticated manner. He establishes an institution, the Uganda Muslim Supreme Council, which assumes all the authority, at least in theory, the religious authority. So for him, he wants to control the Muslim population through that institution he has created, the Uganda Muslim Supreme Council. So that authority largely collapses after Amin has gone. So we go back to the politics of co-opting Muslim leaders, and Museveni has perfected this art. So, so the Americans have come to restore institutions through which the Muslim can be governed, through which the Islam can be dominated. So, what is the link between the pre-colonial, the colonial, post-colonial, and the contemporary? The link is in political power, is in the nature of the state. How is the state able to govern? How does the state govern or seek to govern the Muslim? So briefly, I can say that that is. So you say that what is the internal Muslim critique of the madrasa? So I had deliberately left this out so that I can leave a reason for you to buy the book. If I discuss everything, what would be the motivation for you to?
And I can tell you, if there's one reason I should buy the book, is for me to be able to understand how Muslims actually critique the madrasa.
Yeah, so you're right. So the Muslims are also actually very much critical of the idea that every madrasa can make its own curriculum. They are critical of that. Every single madrasa. So they would prefer to have some sort of arrangement whereby all madrasas, not necessarily all of them, but madrasas of a specific type. So the difference here between the Muslims and the Americans want a single curriculum for all madrasas. Now the Muslims are saying that the madrasas are not homogeneous. The madrasas are different and they serve different purposes. So we can have a uniform curriculum for a specific category of madrasas, and another homogeneous curriculum for a specific category of madrasas. So they want some kind of institutionalization and standardization, though they disagree with the Americans. They also have a critique around organizational issues. They have a critique around around the qualifications of the teachers. Who qualifies to teach in the madrasa? For now, there is no agreed upon. So it's not like these other secular schools whereby the teacher is defined in clear terms. You must have a degree from a university or a diploma or a certificate. There is some kind of certification for one, some kind of academic qualification. So this does not seem to be exactly the case in some cases. So the Muslims are very much critical of this. Then broadly beyond the madrasa, around Islamic knowledge generally, they have a critique of the ways in which the local Muslims privilege the universal over the particular in the interpretation of Islam. They have a critique of the deductive method in the interpretation, as opposed to the privileging of local, beginning from the particular to the universal. And again, I should point out that these are things that are highly contested. These are things that are highly contested. And I'm not claiming to say that this is the position, this is something around which Muslims are. So we have totally competing different perspectives around some of these issues. So those are some of the internal contestations around the madrasa.
Thank you, Dr. Sseremba. And we are at 1:30, which actually means our time is up. We usually keep these engagements at 1.5 hours. So I would like to bring this to an end by thanking Dr. Yahya Sseremba for his superb engagement with us on the subject of his book that is soon to be released. Thank you, Dr. Sseremba, for your time and for the thoughts and insights you've shared. I'm sure we all have benefited and we are much better off in terms of our knowledge of the Muslim discourse and the history of Islamic thought in Uganda and contestations between Islamic religion and the state. Thank you very much for coming on and for speaking. And again, congratulations on what appears to be really an excellent book. I definitely look forward to reading it once it's out. And thank you all for coming on and being with us this morning, this afternoon and evening. And thanks to my esteemed colleague, John R., who makes all this possible, by the way. And I would like to say thank you and have a good day and a good night.
Thank you, Mo.